Emily Neidhardt, and I am a master's candidate for the degree in conservation leadership. And today I'm going to talk to you about my work with Blue Ventures to build capacity for a lionfish market in Belize. So an overview of my presentation today, I'm going to talk to you about why we care about the problem of invasive lionfish, looking at Belize as a case study of lionfish management. I'll talk a little bit about Blue Ventures' role, as well as market development in general for the species. And then I'll talk about my role, my work to identify barriers to lionfish consumption and some possibilities to remove those barriers. And then lastly, lessons learned and recommendations for Blue Ventures from this work. So let's talk about lionfish. Lionfish, the red lionfish, was first introduced in the 1980s. It's originally native to the Indo-Pacific Ocean, but it has quickly established itself as a top predator in the Caribbean and Atlantic Oceans. So the reason it's a perfect invader is because lionfish are sexually mature at 1 year. They have a year-long spawning frequency, so they reproduce all year round. And on average, they produce 2 million eggs every year, so they have an extremely high fecundity. They have no natural predators in their introduced range. Their prey are naive to them, so they don't really know what's going on until it's too late. Lionfish have a generalist diet, so they pretty much eat anything. And they're ecologically flexible, which means they can withstand a high range of temperature, depth, and salinity, and are found in a multitude of habitats. So, and lastly, they have 18 venomous spines. So for all these reasons, they've been known to reduce native fish recruitment on reefs. In the Bahamas, they've been seen to reduce native fish recruitment by 79% on reef patches. And they also competitively exclude other fish species like snapper and grouper from their habitats. So I'd like to introduce the concept of the lionfish invasion through a social ecological lens, first starting with the initial invasion. So there's a general consensus that lionfish were introduced through, they became established through human-mediated causes, either through accidental or intentional aquarium releases, or also through global trade through ballast water, if they're sucked in and then the ballast water is let out. So after initial invasion, we get spread. And this is things like, I mentioned that lionfish are ecologically flexible and they can withstand multiple habitats. And this could continue to expand as oceans continue to warm, and they can maybe be found in more habitats than they're currently found in now. They also have the other biological factors I mentioned, such as high fecundity and spines. And then lastly, oceanic dispersal, just the way that oceanic currents can move larvae around, has really contributed to the spread of the species. So there's also a number of factors that affect how well we can control this invasive species. So these are things like the perceived health and safety risks associated with lionfish. I mentioned they are venomous, and also they have potential to carry ciguatera, which is a toxin that many species of reef fish carry. There are some issues with governance at scale, so things like resource allocation, whether many countries within the invasive range have the ability to control lionfish through resources. Maybe they're limited by manpower, maybe they're limited by finances. And also there's a limited number of regional management plans that really seek to address lionfish on a regional scale throughout many of the small island developing states that lionfish are found in. In Daniela Bueso's work last year, she uncovered that many people that are dealing with the lionfish invasion would like to have a designated facility for lionfish processing and handling, and that currently does not exist. There's also local fishing rules that inhibit control, such as no-take zones. And in these areas, fishing is not allowed at all. So lionfish populations have been known to expand within no-take zones. There's also competing factors for fishers, and this was identified in the lionfish strategy document that should be coming out next year that Blue Ventures created. And these are things like seasons for traditional fisheries like conch and lobster that take precedence over lionfish, or seasons where boats need to be repaired, or adverse weather conditions and things like that. So even though you can technically hunt lionfish all year round, there's really a small window where it is reasonable, where it's feasible to hunt lionfish. And lastly, we have a lack of a global market. So this is fed into by things such as public perceptions of lionfish as being dangerous, or public awareness of lionfish, people don't know about them. So some of these things are uncovered through my research, and others are adapted from the literature or past work like Danny's work. So if control is not addressed, then we have adverse economic impacts from lionfish, which mainly stems from depleted stocks of important fisheries like snapper and grouper. And then this is fed into by fishing pressure on those species, as well as a larger international domestic demand for seafood. And the predator and prey naivety fits in there too, also depleting stocks. So when we look at this all together, we have a massive social ecological web of the factors that influence lionfish invasion, spread, control, and potential economic impacts. So I'd like to talk about Belize as a case study of lionfish management. Belize is where I was located. It's a small country with a population of only 366,000 people and an area of approximately 9,000 square miles. To give you a little context, that's about the size of my home state of Massachusetts. It's very ethnically diverse. People in Belize are identified as Mayan, Mestizo, Mennonite, Garifuna, Creole, Asian. There's many ethnicities, and there's also a variety of languages. So the official language of Belize is English, but Spanish is also spoken, especially where I was living in Sartaneja. Spanish is the main language, and they also speak Belizean Creole. It's considered both part of the Caribbean as well as Central America, and it was only recently independent from England. So it was known as British Honduras before then, and then it was recently independent as of 1981. Belize is known for its extreme biodiversity and distinct ecosystems. And they first saw their first lionfish at Turnip Atoll, which is right here, only 10 years ago in 2008. So after the first lionfish was sighted at Turnip Atoll, Belize jumped into action to reduce lionfish numbers. So the Belize Fisheries Department and NGO partners such as Ecomar, they used techniques such as lionfish tournaments and derbies, where they would pay fishermen for the largest lionfish brought in or the most lionfish brought in. And then they also offered incentives for culling lionfish. So the Belize Fisheries Department and NGO partners created this lionfish wanted dead or alive poster that really painted lionfish as an outlaw, and they offered a $25 reward for every lionfish brought in. I mentioned before in my social ecological web that resource allocation really impacts control, and that this is a prime example of that, because this program had to be canceled after only 3 months because they ran out of money. There were too many lionfish brought in and they just ran out of cash. They also participated in a fisher exchange with Bahamian fishermen, because in the Bahamas, fishermen were dealing with the lionfish invasion on a grander scale. They had much more lionfish to deal with. So participating in a knowledge exchange with Bahamian fishermen would allow some of our Belizean fishermen to learn how they're dealing with that invasion over there. And then after all of this, the 2008 through 2012 lionfish management plan was developed, and in that plan it suggested that lionfish for human consumption is the best method to manage this invasive species. So that's where Blue Ventures comes in. Because Blue Ventures, they really have been piloting the way for this coupled humans and natural systems approach to lionfish management. So Blue Ventures is a marine conservation NGO that's based in the UK, and they focus their efforts on, they have offices and field sites around the world, but their main efforts are focused in Belize, in Sartaneja, which is the largest fishing community in Belize, which I think 80% of Belize's fishers live in Sartaneja. They also work in Timor-Leste and Madagascar. And all of their work is focused on rebuilding fisheries and communities in those countries. So they first started with work in Madagascar, rebuilding this octopus fishery that was dealing with extreme loss in yield. And they worked with the community members to convince them to temporarily close some of these octopus fisheries. And after just a few months, they had extreme success. The yields were much higher, and it really worked as a model for this kind of community-based conservation where the community took ownership of their fisheries. So Blue Ventures works off this model of social enterprise, which I think is really cool. They've got 2 different branches of BV, Blue Ventures. The first is Blue Ventures Expeditions, and this is where volunteers do scientific data collection, either on reef health, such as fish abundance or coral health, and they also do lionfish focused search. And this method of funding is interesting because it's less prone to funding cycles that we see often with grant-funded projects. So sometimes with grants, the money ends. The person has already, added that project to their portfolio of giving, and they're less likely to donate again. So the project will just end in that case. So this is more continuous. And the money that's left over after covering operating costs for Blue Ventures expeditions is given to Blue Ventures Conservation. And Blue Ventures Conservation works on education and outreach, lionfish research and development, and also creating markets as well. So the idea behind lionfish for human consumption is that we want to manage for ecological suppression. So experts agree that we will not be able to eradicate lionfish. They're not going anywhere as much as we would like them to. But there's a threshold that Stephanie Green and her co-authors identified as critical for maintaining ocean health. So if the lionfish densities are above that threshold, the reef will receive a lot too much pressure from lionfish. So we can manage for ecological suppression through a market. It will also alleviate pressure on these overexploited fisheries and provide an alternative livelihood for Belizean fishers. So overall, a market for lionfish presents as a financially sustainable, cost-effective approach that integrates both social and ecological goals. So Blue Ventures did some research to look at supply and demand and market viability in Belize, and they found that a high number of people in fishing communities such as Neidhardt, Chinook, and Copper Bank like the taste of lionfish. The number was between 63 and 94% of people enjoying the taste. So the potential for domestic demand is there. There's already a high international demand for fillet export, but there are some significant barriers to this. So Blue Ventures is not focusing on international demand right now. They're focusing more on domestic demand. Currently, domestic demand exists, but it's low and it's inconsistent as it's driven mainly by tourism, and Belize has fluctuating tourism seasons. So there was some research that Blue Ventures did where they assessed barriers to supply. And these are things like a low price being paid for lionfish. And this is actually currently changing. Lionfish is continuously being marketed as a luxury good. And in the United States, it can fetch up to $16 to $18 per pound, which is higher than the price of yellowfin tuna. But in Belize, it's not that luxury yet. And so there's still a low price paid compared to traditional fisheries. There's also a lack of a lionfish facility where it can be centrally processed. People are afraid of getting stung. It's time consuming to catch because you have to catch them with spears. You can't catch them with hook and line or nets very easily. And many people are unfamiliar with handling them, so they're just not interested in doing that. There's some size requirements for fillet. You need a pretty big lionfish for a good sized fillet that people are wanting to eat. Some areas, especially in Belize, have low catch rates. And some fishers expressed difficulty in maintaining freshness at sea. And so we talked to Tyrell Reyes, who used to work for Blue Ventures, and now he's with Belize Fisheries, about why this could be the case. And it's because the fishers, when they go out for weeks at a time to fish, because they don't come back for multiple weeks, they maintain their ice mainly for those high-value fisheries like conch and lobster. And so finfish do not get as much ice. And lastly, those competing factors I mentioned, such as other fisheries or boat maintenance, things like that, is also a barrier to supply. So through my project, I hope to achieve 3 objectives. The first was to address one of those barriers to supply that I just mentioned, where fishermen had difficulty in identifying buyers. So we're working to address the disconnect between buyers and sellers. I also wanted to determine site-specific barriers to increasing lionfish consumption in Belize City. And then lastly, provide Blue Ventures with recommendations for a community-based social marketing, or CBSM, campaign. So why are we looking at Belize City? So a little bit of background on Belize City. It is the largest city in Belize, but it's still pretty small. It only has about 57,000 people living in it. But Belize is they call it Belize in Belize. If I say Belize, I might be talking about Belize City. Belize City is a hub for the middle class and also a jumping off place for many tourists. And so because lionfish, the price is increasing, it's likely that the middle class and tourists will have the ability to afford lionfish. Restaurant owners in Belize City have also voiced interest in serving lionfish, and some have served it, but on an irregular basis. There's other locations in Belize that are already serving lionfish or have informal markets already in place, and these are places like San Pedro, Kikaker, or Placencia. And then lastly, it's also a landing site for many fishers. You can see this photo here. These are actually boats from Neidhardt in Belize City, and so the idea behind this is that because it's already a landing site, it could reduce barriers along the supply chain for getting lionfish to the restaurants. And so why are we looking at community-based social marketing for my third objective? So community-based social marketing is a behavior change tool that's rooted in social psychology, and it's often been used in the sustainability sector to foster pro-environmental behavior. So it focuses on these behaviors that are non-divisible, meaning they cannot be divided further into other behaviors, and end state, meaning they actually create the desired change within the community. They also should be high impact behaviors, have a high probability of being adopted by the target community, and then have low penetration in the target community. So what that means is that there's not many people already doing it. And so in a community-based social marketing campaign, you first want to select your behavior to focus on, identify the barriers and benefits to that behavior. So this is a main component of my research, is barrier identification. Then you develop a strategy based off of behavior change tools, pilot your campaign, evaluate your pilot, and then implement the campaign broad scale within the community. So I mentioned my first objective was to address disconnect between buyers and sellers. So to do this, I talked with Jen, and she suggested that restaurants had said to her, I used to have someone who sold me lionfish, but I can't get a hold of them anymore. I lost their contact. I don't know who to get it from. And we also saw that that was an issue with supply as well. So I set about to create this Fishery Directory, which I'll pass around here. So this is essentially a pamphlet that will be distributed to restaurants in Belize City and beyond. It contains contact information for reliable fishermen. So the idea is that if a restaurant wants to serve lionfish, they can go through here and just go through the list and essentially find a reliable fisherman to provide them with lionfish. So, well, it looks like just a small pamphlet. This was quite the endeavor. I had some successes and some challenges with this part of my project. For successes, there was definitely interest from both fishermen in Neidhardt and restaurant owners in Belize City. So first we set about to ask them, how interested would you be in this idea? And there was a lot of interest there from both sides. I also had a lot of help from Dionary Cabrera, who works for Blue Ventures. She's from Neidhardt, she speaks Spanish. Because I found that the language barrier in Neidhardt was difficult for me, especially I don't speak Spanish, but having her come around, we went to every single house in the community of Neidhardt, knocking on doors, flyering, and talking to them about this idea. And so having her with me, and she knew where the fishermen lived and how to speak Spanish, was really a godsend. The fishers' schedules were also difficult to work around. I mentioned that they go to sea for weeks at a time. So figuring out when they would be in the village so I could properly time my communications with them was very critical. Location was also a challenge because while fishers in Neidhardt were interested, fishers in Belize City were not. And they mainly fish with hook and line, and there was just not a lot of interest in lionfish there. So we focused mainly on fishers in Neidhardt. And then lastly, I did not get to distribute this, unfortunately. I did get it printed on the last day that I was in Belize, so I gave BV 40 copies. But I would have liked to distribute it myself just to make sure it was in the hands of the people that needed it. So my second objective was to look at site-specific barriers to lionfish consumption in Belize City. Excuse me. So I conducted a face-to-face survey of 98 individuals, 89 of which were seafood consumers. And so the rest of these results will relate to those 89 seafood consumers. And that broke down further into 46 tourists and 43 Belizeans, so pretty even split, but allowed for comparative analysis between those two groups. So I conducted face-to-face surveys in 2 restaurants, Nery's and Anna's Lunchbox, both in Belize City. They both serve Belizean cuisine, but Anna's caters a bit more towards tourists. It's in the water taxi terminal, so all the tourists moving through Belize City to the northern keys for island life, they go through Belize City and they go through Anna's Lunchbox. And then another main difference is that Anna serves alcohol where Nery's does not. So We conducted this survey where we asked people questions about their general seafood consumption. We also wanted to know what drivers of seafood consumption were. So what motivates people to purchase certain seafood dishes at restaurants. So in order to do that, I performed a ranking exercise with these attribute cards. So I'll pass these around. They each have an attribute of seafood, whether it be taste, cost, freshness, environmental impact, benefit to the local community, etc., as well as an example and description. And then Garrett drew me some lovely little visuals to aid in comprehension. So I'll go through each of these on the screen, but I'll pass them around. So we're looking at motivations to seafood consumption as well as awareness of lionfish, and then some demographics as well, so we could potentially segment our audience if we're looking for different recommendations for different audience segments. For my analysis, I analyzed my data through frequencies, descriptives, and then chi-square tests for comparisons between groups. So these are my cards. They're things like familiarity. People choose what they're used to eating. And these attributes were all selected by looking through the literature on different drivers of seafood consumption, as well as past research in Belize that suggested that over 80% of tourists would purchase lionfish if they knew that it benefited fishermen and benefited the reef. And then these were piloted with about 10 people in Neidhardt and then adjusted based off of that feedback. So familiarity, seafood that supports my community if it provides an income to local fishers. Freshness, whatever came in that day regardless of what it was. Health, seafood that's nutritious or prepared in a healthy way. And I gave the example of grilled compared to fried. Cost, low price or high price. I didn't want to exclude anyone. Taste, seafood with the best flavor. And then low environmental impact, either seafood that is fished sustainably or benefits the reef. And then lastly, we did a little bit of outreach. We partnered with these restaurants, Mary's and Anna's, to provide lionfish tasters. So we provided the lionfish and then we paid them for preparation as well as the rest of the ingredients. And we made lionfish ceviche, which ceviche is a very popular dish in Belize, as well as lionfish fingers. So we did this to continue to build partnerships with these restaurants, as well as promoting exposure to lionfish in the general public. We also wanted to gauge people's willingness to try lionfish, as well as the average taste rating. So 54 people, 74%, accepted a taster. Some chose not to because they were eating or they had just eaten. I forgot to mention that we were approaching people after they ordered at these restaurants, and so it did take a little bit of effort to feel comfortable approaching strangers as they were sitting down to a nice meal, but we got over it pretty quickly. On average, people rated the taste of lionfish as an 8 with a standard deviation of about 1.5, so generally a pretty high rating for the taste. In regards to seafood consumption, I mentioned that 91% or 89 people that I surveyed were seafood consumers, so a large portion of our respondents. And the majority of people, over 55%, ate seafood at least once a week. So we asked them what they generally purchased at a restaurant when they were ordering seafood. And we coded their primary seafood choice as the first seafood they mentioned, if they mentioned more than one. So people primarily said fish, with 51% saying fish, 28% saying shrimp, and then 13% saying lobster. So this is Caribbean spiny lobster. It's important to note that responses to this question might have been temporally influenced because it was open season for lobster and closed season for conch. So we did have a small amount, 3% saying conch, but maybe it could have been more if it was open season for conch. There were some interesting differences between tourists and Belizeans and what their fish choices were when we broke down this 51% into different fish choices. So Belizeans prefer snapper. 57% of Belizeans chose snapper as their primary choice. And then tourists primarily chose salmon. So really some interesting cultural differences there. We also saw some differences between tourists and Belizeans in how they preferred their seafood to be prepared. So in Belize, you often see whole fish coming out, head and all. It's very common. So I was interested to see, is there a difference there? So significantly more Belizeans preferred whole fish to fillet, and significantly more tourists preferred fillet to whole fish. So you can see the significance as indicated by the asterisks on those bar charts. And then we were interested to see, we were looking at neophobia a little bit. So if people are trying a new type of seafood, are they more willing to try it in a familiar preparation? So for example, with rice and beans, or in a unique and interesting way they hadn't had before. And actually, so across the board between both Belizeans and tourists, there was more interest in a new seafood prepared in a unique way. So we had 76% of our respondents aware of lionfish. We asked them if they'd heard about lionfish, and 76% said yes. Significantly more Belizeans had heard about lionfish, 87%, than tourists, 66%. However, nearly half of the people we surveyed had incorrect information about lionfish. So for example, 59% of Belizeans thought that lionfish were poisonous, and this is similar to other human dimensions work done in Belize about lionfish. But the main difference is that lionfish are venomous and not poisonous, and the difference is in the delivery of the toxin. So poisonous things generally cannot be consumed without harming the individual, whereas venomous things are safe to eat once the delivery method of the toxin, like the spine or the fang, is removed. And 45% of tourists only knew that lionfish existed or what they looked like they said they had stripes. So I thought that was really interesting, the difference in misinformation and lack of information between these two groups. So I coded responses to the question, what have you heard about lionfish, just using a word cloud. And so looking at this, the size of the word denotes the frequency with which it was said. So poisonous appeared in this question 22 times. You see venomous down here, very small. So it was there, but it wasn't always there. And then also I see invasive pretty large, as well as dangerous, and I know they exist. So we saw that quite often. And then asked people if they had tried lionfish, if they'd consumed it before. So significantly more Belizeans had tried lionfish than tourists, with 29% of Belizeans trying lionfish over 6% of tourists. And then everyone who had tried it before had liked the taste, and all but 2 people would order it in a restaurant. And those people would not order it in a restaurant because they were fishermen, they could fish it themselves, or they had preference for other fisheries. One person said to me, "It's just not snapper, I don't want it." We asked them what they'd be willing to pay for a lionfish dish, and the mean was 23 Belize dollars and 36 cents. So you can see the ratio here is it's 2 Belize dollars to 1 US dollar. So that's about 11 US dollars. And I only had 14 people answer this question because we only asked it to people who had tried lionfish before. So the sample size is slightly small, but there was about a 10 Belize dollar difference between tourists and Belizeans. So tourists were willing to pay on average 10 Belize dollars more than tourists for lionfish. And then we asked people who hadn't tried lionfish what were the reasons for not trying it. 54% of people said they hadn't tried it because they hadn't seen it on the menu anywhere. It wasn't available to them. I'd like to go into the results of my attribute ranking now. So this shows the frequency of ranks overall for all respondents. So you can see the blue is the number of people who ranked each attribute as number 1 most important. Green is second most important, purple is third most important, and orange is fourth most important. So I had 7 cards and I asked them to rank their top 4. So overall, we saw that health was the most important number 1 rated attribute to everybody. So 33% of people ranked health as their most important consideration, and 66% of people ranked it within their top 4. Taste was the highest ranked attribute overall, with 83% of respondents ranking it somewhere in their top 4. And then freshness was the attribute that was ranked second highest in terms of the second most people ranking it number 1. So 24% of people ranked it as their most important, and then 75% of people ranked it in their top 4. So we're really seeing health, taste, and freshness as the most important attributes for people when they order a seafood dish. Familiarity and cost were moderately ranked. Only 53% of people ranked familiarity in their top 4. So this is consistent with the results I saw in that previous graph where we looked at would you prefer seafood in a unique dish or a familiar dish. Familiar wasn't very high up, so we're seeing that echoed here in this graph. And then cost. Cost was moderately ranked as well, but in the literature it does present as a potential barrier to consumption. And so we can't discount cost in the case of lionfish because I mentioned it is a luxury good. Will continue to probably increase in price. And with Belizean consumers willing to pay on average 10 USD for a lionfish dish, they may be priced out of lionfish in the future. So the lowest ranked attributes were supports my community and low environmental impact. And these each had only 33% of participants ranking them somewhere in their top 4. So this says a couple things to me. This is not what we expected based off of past research that suggested tourists would purchase lionfish for these reasons. But for supports my community, we did see about 37% of Belizeans ranking this compared to 30% of tourists. And this could have been bolstered for Belizeans based off of proximity to the coastline and to fishing communities. Fishing is incredibly important in Belize, as 3% of their GDP comes from fishing, and many of the fisheries, or almost all the fisheries, are small and artisanal. So even though I only had 18% of my Belizean respondents coming from inland districts and I couldn't do a comparison, it's possible that many of our Belizean respondents lived near fishing communities. And also the wording of this question could have influenced responses. I wished I had written supports the local community instead of supports my community, because some people that are visiting Belize, or they just might not live in a fishing community. So changing that wording may have changed these results a little bit. And for the environmental impact attribute, even though this was low, I think it shows that Dianaria and I did not bias our participants with our verbal script. We wanted to make sure that we did not emphasize that we were from Blue Ventures, studying lionfish. Really didn't want to emphasize that conservation community aspect. So even though this wasn't highly ranked, I think it shows that our respondents remained pretty objective and they didn't tell us just what we wanted to hear. So this table shows the breakdown between my different comparative groups in terms of what percentage of that group ranked each attribute in their top 4. So we see significant differences in the highlighted cells here. So we only saw differences between Belizeans and tourists, with significantly more tourists ranking environmental impact over Belizeans, and then Belizeans significantly ranked health over tourists. And I don't want to speculate too much about why this could be. It could have been different if we had rating instead of ranking. Maybe that would have changed the results for environmental impact. It's not that Belizeans are not interested in that, but maybe some things rate higher. And then for health, I thought maybe because tourists are on vacation, they're not as concerned with their health choices. But there's just some interesting results here. And they speak to if Blue Ventures wants to segment their audience by using different campaign materials to target different groups, they could potentially use these 2 differences in messaging. So from my work, I uncovered 3 barriers to lionfish consumption that are concurrent with barriers in community-based social marketing. So the first is a lack of knowledge, either just missing knowledge, missing information, or incorrect information. The second was existing norms and preferences around seafood consumption. And the last is structural barriers to convenience. So what I mean by this is the 54% of people who said that they hadn't tried lionfish because they never saw it on a menu. So people are not seeing it on a menu because there are structural barriers to it being on a menu. So it kind of goes down the chain of, why isn't lionfish on the menu? There's structural barriers there. So based off of my work, I came up with some recommendations for Blue Ventures. The first is to really capitalize on these motivations that we uncovered in their messaging around lionfish. So health was incredibly important, not only to Belizeans, but to the entire sample as a whole. So lionfish has higher levels of N3 fatty acids compared to some other local fish species, so really highlighting that. It also has, it's a relatively good source of mineral and trace element nutrients, and it's a low contributor to mercury toxicity. So lionfish overall is a good, healthy choice, and emphasizing that could help to increase consumption. Lionfish do carry the potential, or have the potential to carry ciguatera toxin, but they haven't been found in this, it hasn't been found in this region of Belize. But just maintaining transparency about the possibility for lionfish to carry ciguatera toxin, and as I've read it before in some of Jen Chapman's papers, just maintaining, pressuring for a more specific test for ciguatera, because it does often lead to false positives. But just maintaining transparency about both health benefits and risks of lionfish could help for increasing consumption. Taste was also incredibly important. So relating the taste to what people like. So it's similar to snapper, it's a nice white fish. I often have heard lionfish related to hogfish, but hogfish didn't even come up once when I asked people what they primarily chose for seafood. So maybe sticking to snapper it would be better in terms of getting people to eat it, having it related to something that they know. And then freshness was also important. So there are some barriers to freshness. We talked about how it's difficult to keep the ice cold for the entire fishing journey. But if lionfish is frozen immediately, it does retain its taste, and the difference to texture is negligible. So there are some benefits here for lionfish that we can capitalize on these different attributes. And if Blue Ventures wants to segment their audience depending on funding availability and potentially where the messages are placed, they can have specific messages for tourists. So I would focus on the environmental messages or the taste messages for tourists. So like lionfish is the taste of Belize, be adventurous, try it, or those traditional messages around, save the reef, eat lionfish. For Belizeans, I would really focus on health. In my report, I had the frequencies for the attribute rankings for both Belizeans and tourists. And Belizeans really care about health. So capitalizing on that for them will help to reach a Belizean local audience. Lastly, there are some tools for community-based social marketing that can be used that are a little bit less specific to my research, but still helpful in creating a really successful behavior change campaign. So using stickers to influence both norms and knowledge would be a great idea because stickers are durable, long-lasting, and inexpensive. And so by influencing norms, saying Belize eats the lion, or everyone, percentage of people love lionfish, we can influence some of those norms around, descriptive norms around what people are doing. And then also knowledge that can be informational as well. So really killing two birds with one stone, both social diffusion of knowledge as well as influencing norms. Blue Ventures could also focus on lionfish champions, like they could secure commitments from either people who've tried lionfish or people who serve lionfish in restaurants to talk about their experience and just spread that knowledge around. Celebrity endorsements could also be used, but it's critical that there's been a paper out this year about celebrity endorsements for conservation, and it suggests that you should use them very carefully. The celebrity should be knowledgeable and appear to actually really care about what they're talking about in order for this to work appropriately and not backfire. Blue Ventures does a lot of outreach, but increasing the frequency of outreach events will help to address that lack of knowledge or misinformation. And also partnering with nearby NGOs like Tide, Mar Alliance, or Oceana would help to expand the reach of their outreach efforts. Using the Fishery Directory I created will help to reduce some of those structural barriers to convenience, allowing more restaurant owners to put lionfish on their menu and then more people to buy it. And then lastly, it's really critical that whatever campaign Blue Ventures develops is piloted with a small segment of the community and then critically evaluated, because many social marketing campaigns for conservation suffer from a lack of systematic evaluation. So if I had the chance to go back to Neidhardt and do some work with Blue Ventures again, I'd love to explore the cause of this poisonous, venomous misconception. There are a couple potential reasons for this. One of them could be because the word for poisonous and venomous in Spanish is the same, it's venenoso. So maybe it's a translation, it comes from translation. It could also come from popular media. I read an article by The Guardian where the headline was, "Poisonous lionfish fatal to humans found in Mediterranean." So in addition to fear mongering, that's also spreading misinformation. So it could be coming from a variety of sources, and I'd like to see where it's coming from. I'd also like to critically evaluate the effectiveness of that Fishery Directory. How many restaurants are using it? How many fishers are being called about lionfish? How much are they selling? Is the directory current? And just maintaining the effectiveness of that piece of material. And then lastly, I think specific message testing for a segmented audience is critical to making sure that this is the first step in saying, oh, these messages might work for these groups, but specific message testing is important to make sure that we're really on the right track for community-based social marketing materials. And with that, I'd like to take any questions.